This collection of openings explores a single, dramatic moment through the lenses of three different worlds. It is a story of betrayal, truth, and resilience, retold in the allegorical language of a fable, the harsh grit of the American West, and the intimate, aching whispers of a romance. Each tale begins in the same place, a crucible of judgment where a life is about to be unmade, or perhaps forged anew. In the great hall of reckoning, where legacies were weighed and bloodlines were measured, silence was a currency more valuable than gold. It clung to the ancient, carved timbers of the ceiling and settled like dust upon the heavy oak benches. Today, that silence was thick with the bitter scent of broken vows. Upon one of these benches sat Clara, known throughout the city for the beautiful designs she wove, not with thread, but with brick and glass. Now, her own design for life was being systematically unwoven. The swell of her womb, carrying the thread of a new life, felt less like a promise and more like an anchor, pulling her down into the cold depths of despair. Across the chasm of polished stone sat the merchant prince, Marcus Thorne. He was a man forged in the image of his father, the great Alastair Thorne, a titan who had built an empire from nothing. Marcus wore his legacy like a tailored suit of armor, impenetrable and cold. His face, handsome and severe, was a mask of placid control, but his stillness was that of a predator conserving its energy for the final strike. He had not built this life with Clara. He had acquired her, a beautiful and useful asset, and now he was liquidating her. Beside him, in the gallery, sat the gilded finch, Sloane. She was a creature of shimmering surfaces and sharp edges, her beauty a weapon she wielded with breathtaking precision. Her crimson dress was a splash of blood against the somber wood of the hall. She did not watch the proceedings with the anxiety of a lover, but with the smug satisfaction of a victor. She saw herself not as a homewrecker, but as a necessary force of nature, culling the weak from the strong. Clara was weak, Sloane was strong. In her mind, the logic was as clean and brutal as a headsman's axe. Her small, sharp smile, aimed directly at Clara, was not merely triumphant, it was a philosophical statement. It said, "This is the way of the world. The strong take what they want, and the weak tell stories about justice." The petitioner, Marcus Thorne, announced the merchant's proctor, his voice echoing in the chamber, contests the lineage of the unborn child. He posits that the loom of his house has been tainted by a foreign thread. The accusation was so monstrously false, it stole the breath from Clara's lungs. A bitter laugh caught in her throat. Faithful, dedicated. The words Marcus's man used to describe him were a perversion of reality. He had been a faithful and dedicated husband only to his own ambition. He therefore petitions the arbiter, the proctor continued, to have all shared assets, the lands, the coffers, the very name of Thorne frozen, pending a full accounting under the presumption of infidelity. The arbiter of this hall was Judge Evelyn Roth, a woman whose eyes missed nothing, and whose reputation for fairness was rivaled only by her intolerance for deceit. She peered over her spectacles, her gaze sweeping from Marcus's cold indifference to Sloane's glittering contempt, and finally resting on Clara's pale, strained face. "And on what grounds does he base this presumption?" the arbiter asked, her voice cutting through the tension. The proctor's answer was a masterclass in slander, a tapestry woven from half-truths and outright lies about Clara's supposed secretive behaviors. Clara looked at Marcus, her eyes pleading for a shred of the man she once knew, the man who had promised to build a world with her. He met her gaze for a fleeting second, and his eyes were not angry or sad. They were chillingly empty, like a vault that had been cleared of all valuables. "My client has already consented to the test of truth," Clara's own counsel, Nina Calloway, stated, her voice a firm anchor in the swirling chaos. The results were delivered to this hall by sealed courier this morning. We are prepared to have the scroll of lineage unsealed and read. A flicker of surprise crossed Marcus's face. This was not part of his calculation. He had expected tears, delays, a fight that would make her look guilty. He had not expected swift, calm compliance. The gilded finch leaned forward, her predatory focus now fixed upon the single, sealed scroll that lay before the arbiter. Judge Roth picked up the scroll. Its wax seal bore the crest of the Alchemists' Guild, who dealt in the absolute truths of blood and bone. "The court is in possession of the findings," she announced. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight. Clara knew the truth, but the sheer, malevolent force of Marcus's lie had planted a seed of terror in her soul. What if they had somehow corrupted the test? What if, in this world of power and influence, truth itself could be bought and sold? She risked one last glance at Sloane. The finch was no longer looking at the arbiter. She was looking directly at Clara, and as the judge began to break the wax seal, Sloane's lips curved back into that same vicious, triumphant smile. It was the smile that broke her. It was the final, crushing weight of the cruelty, the gaslighting, the absolute certainty of the woman who had stolen her life and was now reveling in its destruction. The carved timbers of the ceiling began to tilt. The arbiter's voice became a distant echo. The threads of her consciousness, strained for so long, finally snapped. Her hand slipped from the table, and as the world dissolved into a silent, suffocating darkness, her last thought was of that smile, a brand of pure evil seared upon her soul. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 2, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance, của câu chuyện. 8 years ago, the world had been a kaleidoscope of brilliant color. Clara remembered the exact shade of blue in Marcus's eyes the day he proposed to her on a windswept cliff overlooking the Pacific, the wind whipping his dark hair as he dropped to one knee. He'd spoken of a future built together, a partnership, a legacy. She, a rising star at a prestigious architectural firm, and he, a junior vice president at his father's lucrative company, Thorne and Son Properties. Their life, in the beginning, was an idyllic, carefully curated montage of success. The shift was subtle at first, a slow cooling she barely registered. After his father, Alastair Thorne, passed away from a sudden heart attack 4 years into their marriage, Marcus changed. The weight of being the sole son in Thorne and Son settled on him like a shroud. The ambition that had once been an exhilarating, shared adventure became something harder, more obsessive and solitary. "The board is pushing for a more aggressive quarter," he'd say, coming home long after she'd gone to bed. His voice, once warm and intimate, now held the clipped, impersonal tone of a business meeting. His grief, she thought, had walled him off, and she waited patiently on the other side for his return. Clara, wanting to be the supportive wife, scaled back her own projects, telling herself it was temporary. She started managing their magnificent, glass-walled home, hosting dinner parties for his business associates, becoming the gracious, smiling woman on the arm of the brilliant CEO. One day, with a startling pang of loss, she realized she was playing a part, and she'd forgotten how to leave the stage. Her drafting table in the corner of the study, once the vibrant heart of her creativity, gathered a thin, reverent layer of dust, becoming a relic in the museum of the woman she used to be. The late nights became more frequent. The business trips stretched from 2 days to 5. When he was home, he was distant. His phone, a permanent extension of his hand, was always angled away from her with a new, reflexive secrecy. He would compliment her dress, but his eyes wouldn't really see her. He would ask about her day, but would be scrolling through emails before she could answer. The easy intimacy they once shared evaporated, replaced by a polite, formal distance that was more painful than any argument. The first concrete crack in her denial came 6 months before the divorce papers. It was an earring, a single diamond and sapphire drop earring nestled deep in the passenger seat cushion of his car. It wasn't hers. Clara's style was minimalist, modern. This was expensive, flashy, and utterly foreign. When she confronted him that evening, holding the glittering jewel in her trembling palm, he didn't even flinch. He laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Robert Peterson's wife, Melinda, was in the car last week. We were coming back from that charity gala. It must be hers. I'll have my assistant send it back to her." He was so smooth, so plausible, that for a moment she almost believed him. But there was a coldness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a flicker of something calculating and contemptuous. He wasn't just lying, he was insulted that she'd even dared to ask. He was gaslighting her, making her feel foolish and paranoid for noticing the evidence of his betrayal. That night, for the first time in their marriage, he slept in the guest room. He said he had an early conference call and didn't want to wake her. The gulf between them had become a chasm. Then came the discovery that shattered everything. He was in the shower, the percussive spray of water, a stark contrast to the silence in the bedroom. His phone, usually guarded like a state secret, buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. A name flashed on the screen, Sloan A. A string of messages followed one after the other, each one a dagger in Clara's heart. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. That stuffy old house must feel like a prison. You belong with me. When are you finally going to leave her? You promised." She felt the blood drain from her face. She scrolled up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control her thumb. There were months of messages, pictures, Sloan, blonde, and laughing on a boat that Clara recognized as Marcus's. Sloan in a slinky dress at a restaurant Clara had wanted to try for their anniversary. An anniversary. Marcus had claimed he had to miss for an urgent business trip to Singapore. The betrayal was so absolute, so extensive, it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a fling, it was a whole other life, a life from which she had been completely and deliberately excluded. An icy calm settled over her. When he walked out of the bathroom, a towel slung low around his waist, she was sitting on the bed, his phone in her hand. The mask of the devoted husband fell away instantly. There was no apology, no remorse. There was only annoyance, as if she had committed the ultimate transgression by uncovering his secret. "You went through my phone," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Who is she, Marcus?" "It's none of your business," he snarled, snatching the phone from her. "This is what happens when you get paranoid and insecure, Clara. You go looking for trouble, and you find it." The argument that followed was the ugliest of her life. He twisted everything, turning his infidelity into her failure. She was too focused on her hobby of architecture. She wasn't spontaneous enough. She didn't support his ambitions. She'd let herself go. Each word was a calculated strike designed to shatter her self-worth. It was during that fight, in a moment of pure, desperate defiance, that she told him. She had found out only 2 weeks prior and had been waiting for the perfect moment, hoping it would be the good news that could heal the growing rift between them. "I'm pregnant," she cried out, the words a last, desperate plea. She watched his face, praying for a flicker of the man she had married. For a moment, she saw something. Shock, confusion, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. "Pregnant?" he repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with a terrifying new suspicion. 2 days later, she was served with divorce papers. The grounds were irreconcilable differences. And 2 weeks after that, the amended petition arrived. He was formally denying paternity and accusing her of adultery. He had taken the last, fragile ember of their dying fire, the beautiful secret of their child, and had brutally stamped it out. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 3, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance của câu chuyện. Clara woke to the sharp, sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and the rhythmic, gentle beep of a machine next to her head. A soft, warm hand was stroking her hair, pulling her back from the suffocating darkness. She pried her heavy eyelids open to see Nina Calloway's face etched with a concern that was more than just professional. It was human. "Hey," Nina said softly, "you're in the courthouse infirmary. You fainted. You gave us all a scare." The courtroom, the smirk, the envelope, it all came rushing back, and Clara tried to sit up, a panicked gasp escaping her. "The results? Did the judge read them?" "Shh, easy," Nina soothed, gently pushing her back down onto the stiff cot. The judge called an immediate recess. She postponed the reading. She was more concerned about you and the baby. A nurse bustled in, confirming what Nina was saying. The paramedics had checked them both out. Clara's blood pressure was high and she was dehydrated, but the baby's heartbeat was strong. A tiny, resilient drumbeat in the midst of chaos. "You're both fighters," the nurse had said with a kind smile. Relief washed over Clara, so potent it felt like weakness. It was a temporary reprieve, a pause button on her public execution. She lay back, the adrenaline ebbing away to reveal a deep, aching cold. "He didn't even look at me, did he?" Clara whispered, the memory of Marcus's frozen posture clear in her mind. "When I fell, he didn't move." Nina's expression tightened, her professional composure hardening into a protective shield. "No, Clara, he didn't," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "His lawyer and the other woman, they just looked annoyed at the delay. That's all." The cruelty of it was a fresh wound, deeper than all the others. It solidified a truth that had been slowly dawning on her. The Marcus she had loved was gone, or perhaps had never truly existed at all. The man in that courtroom was a predator, and she was his prey. The next 2 weeks were a special kind of hell, orchestrated with brutal efficiency. Citing the stress of the ongoing litigation and uncertainty, Marcus's lawyer successfully filed an emergency motion to freeze all their joint assets. The credit cards Clara used for groceries and gas were declined. The automatic payment for her car lease was rejected. Then, the eviction notice arrived, taped to the door of the sterile, soulless condo Marcus had rented for her after kicking her out of their marital home, a home she had designed, a home where Sloane was likely now sleeping in her bed. He was legally no longer paying for it. He was strangling her financially, trying to force her into a quick, cheap settlement where she would sign away her rights for pennies on the dollar just to survive. It was a siege, and he was starving her out. Humiliation burned as she spent a frantic afternoon on the phone with her parents, a retired teacher, and a librarian in Ohio. They were horrified, of course, and immediately wired her what they could from their modest savings. It was enough to keep a roof over her head and food in the fridge for a month, maybe 2, but the shame was a bitter pill. She was 34 years old, a once successful architect, now completely dependent on her parents' retirement fund to house and feed herself and her unborn child. It was during a tearful call with her younger sister, Lena, a fiercely practical nurse, that the spark of defiance was reignited. "You can't let him do this, Clara," Lena said, her voice steely with an anger Clara herself was too exhausted to feel. "He's not just divorcing you, he's trying to destroy you. You can't just sit there and defend yourself from his attacks. You have to fight back. There has to be something. Men like Marcus, men with that much ego and money, They always have secrets. You just have to find the right stone to turn over. Hanging up the phone, Clara looked around the generic, beige-walled condo. It was a prison designed by her husband. She thought of her baby, of the life she wanted to give him, a life free from the shadow of this monstrous man. Lena was right. She couldn't play defense anymore. This wasn't a marriage ending, it was a war. And Marcus had just taught her that in war there are no rules. A new fire, small but hot, began to burn through the fog of her despair. He had started this war, but she was going to finish it. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 4, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance của câu chuyện. The next day, Clara walked into Nina Calloway's office with a new fire in her eyes. The trembling, defeated woman from the infirmary was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and more focused. Nina, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her early 40s, had taken the case pro bono after a mutual friend had made the introduction, moved by the sheer injustice of Clara's situation. She watched Clara take a seat, noticing the subtle shift in her posture. Her back was straighter, her hands steady. "He's trying to bleed me dry," Clara said, her voice devoid of the quavering fear it had held before. "He thinks if he makes me desperate enough, I'll sign anything. He's wrong." Nina leaned forward, a pen poised over a legal pad. "I agree. A defensive strategy isn't going to cut it. We know the paternity test will prove the baby is his. That will get you child support. But to get a fair settlement, to get what you are owed for 8 years of marriage and professional sacrifice, we need leverage." She paused, her expression turning grim. "He's hidden his money. I'm sure of it. Shell corporations, offshore accounts. It's a classic rich man's divorce playbook. So we need a forensic accountant," Clara stated, the term sounding foreign and aggressive on her tongue. "We do," Nina confirmed. "A good one. But they're expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars just to start." Clara's heart sank. It was money she didn't have. "So, what do we do?" Nina tapped her pen for a long moment, her eyes narrowed in thought. "We can petition the court to have Marcus's assets pay for the accountant, arguing it's a necessary expense for discovery. With his public slander of you, Judge Roth might be inclined to grant it. But it's not a guarantee. We need something else, something personal." She leaned in, her gaze intense. "You were married to him for 8 years, Clara. You lived in that house. You saw his business dealings up close. Think, was there anything that ever struck you as odd? Anything he was intensely private about?" Clara closed her eyes, forcing herself to walk back through the museum of her marriage, pushing past the pain and looking for details, for artifacts she might have missed. She thought about his office, the one she was never allowed to enter when he was working, the locked file cabinet in the corner, his obsessive privacy about his family history. Marcus's father, Alastair Thorne, had been a hard, domineering man who had built the company from scratch. His mother, Beatrice, was a quiet, nervous woman who seemed to live in her husband's shadow. Beatrice and Marcus had a strained, almost non-existent relationship. After Alastair's death, Beatrice had moved to a retirement community in Florida and cut off contact with her son almost entirely. Clara had only met her a handful of times, and the woman had always seemed afraid. "His mother," Clara said slowly, her eyes snapping open. "Beatrice. They don't speak. After his father died, she just vanished from his life. He always said she was fragile and couldn't handle the stress of his world." She paused, a specific memory rising to the surface, sharp and clear. "But there was a time, at Alastair's funeral, she said something strange to me." "What did she say?" Nina pressed, leaning in. "We were at the reception. Marcus was holding court, accepting condolences like he was accepting an award. Beatrice grabbed my arm. She looked terrified," Clara recalled, the phantom grip of the old woman's fingers prickling her skin. She whispered, He's not like his father. Thank God for that. Alastair had a cruel heart. But Marcus has a hole where his heart should be. Be careful, my dear. The foundation of this house is built on a lie. Nina's pen stopped moving. The foundation of this house is built on a lie. What did you think she meant at the time? I thought she was just a grieving, rambling widow, Clara admitted. I thought this house meant the family, their emotional state. But she was looking at the official company portrait of Alastair on the wall when she said it. Her eyes widened as a thrilling, dangerous idea began to form. What if she meant the company? Thorn and Son? The air in the room crackled with a new energy. Nina, Clara said, her voice trembling with the audacity of her thought. The paternity test for our baby, it compares the baby's DNA to Marcus's. Yes, Nina said, her sharp, legal mind instantly processing the implications. What if we could compare Marcus's DNA to his father's? Nina stared at her, the initial shock on her face melting into a look of fierce, calculating excitement. Alastair Thorn is deceased. How could we get a sample? When he had his first heart attack 2 years before he died, he was treated at St. Jude's Medical Center. Clara remembered, the details flooding back. They did extensive tests, biopsies. They would still have his tissue samples in their pathology archives. I signed some of the admission paperwork. It was a long shot, a wild, improbable stab in the dark, based on the cryptic words of a frightened old woman. But it was the first stone, and Clara had a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that if she could just turn it over, the entire rotten foundation of Marcus Thorn's world would come crumbling down. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 5, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance của câu chuyện. Getting a judge to sign a subpoena for the medical records of a dead man based on what amounted to the cryptic utterance of an estranged mother was a monumental task. Robert Peterson, Marcus's lawyer, fought it with everything he had. He stood before Judge Roth in a preliminary hearing, his voice dripping with condescending disbelief. Your Honor, this is a disgusting, ghoulish fishing expedition, he argued, his tone polished and indignant. It is a desperate attempt by a scorned woman to harass a grieving son. Mrs. Sterling clearly demonstrated her emotional instability when she fainted in this very courtroom. Now she comes to you with this conspiracy theory pulled from a soap opera. She wants to desecrate the memory of Alastair Thorn, a titan of this city, all to distract from her own infidelity. The words were designed to paint Clara as hysterical and vindictive. For a moment, she felt a familiar wave of shame and self-doubt. But then she met Nina's steady gaze. Nina had prepared her for this, for the way Peterson would twist her pain into a weapon against her. She straightened her spine and held his stare. When Peterson finished, Nina Chen rose, her presence a stark contrast to his slick theatrics. She was calm, commanding, and her every word was deliberate. Your Honor, Nina began, her voice resonating with quiet authority. The entire premise of Mr. Thorn's case against my client rests on a question of blood, of lineage. He has publicly and callously questioned the parentage of his own unborn child to gain a financial advantage. He has made genetics the central theme of this divorce. She let that hang in the air for a moment, allowing the hypocrisy of Peterson's argument to settle over the room. All we are asking, she continued, is to apply that same standard of scrutiny to the lineage that grants him his own immense wealth and power. Thorn and Son Properties is a family business, passed from father to son. The vast majority of Mr. Thorn's personal wealth is tied up in a family trust, a trust whose charter, I am sure, is predicated on direct biological succession. If Mr. Thorne believes parentage is so critically important when it comes to his responsibilities, shouldn't it be equally important when it comes to his privileges? Her logic was an elegant, inescapable trap. We are not desecrating a memory, Your Honor. We are seeking the whole truth in a case where my opponent has been content to deal only in slanderous half-truths. Judge Roth listened, her fingers steepled, her eyes unreadable. She looked from Nina's earnest face to Peterson's indignant one. She looked at Marcus, who sat rigid with a fury he could barely contain. The subpoena for his father's medical records was an unexpected move, a breach in the walls of his carefully constructed fortress, and it had clearly rattled him. Finally, the judge's gaze settled on Clara, who met it without flinching, her expression a mixture of fear and newfound resolve. "Motion granted," the judge said, her voice flat and final. "Street, Jude's Medical Center, will be subpoenaed for any and all biological materials belonging to the deceased Alastair Thorne. The lab will run a Y chromosome STR analysis comparing the samples of Alastair Thorne to Daniel Collins. The results will be delivered directly to this court and will be read along with the results of the prenatal paternity test when we reconvene." She struck her gavel once. "This court is adjourned." The victory was intoxicating but terrifying. Clara and Nina had pushed the button. Now they had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. While they waited for the new court date and the lab results, they went to work. Nina, armed with the judge's clear impatience toward Marcus's tactics, successfully petitioned the court to approve the forensic accountant, arguing that Marcus's own challenge to the child's legitimacy made a full accounting essential. The man they hired was a quiet, balding genius named Michael Finch, who spoke of spreadsheets and ledgers with the passion of a poet. "The money is the ghost in the machine," he told Clara during their first meeting in Nina's small conference room. "It's never really gone. It just changes shape, moves through walls. My job is to find its shadow." For days, Clara sat with Michael, piecing together the financial skeleton of her marriage. It was painstaking, emotionally draining work. Every credit card statement was a map of Marcus's secret life with Sloane. A charge for a $5,000 necklace from a jeweler in New York, a $7,500 charge for a weekend at a luxury spa in Napa, a $10,000 wire transfer to a bank in the Cayman Islands with the memo "Ashford Design Consultation." "This is her," Clara said, her finger tracing the name on the statement, her voice flat. "Sloane Ashford. She's an interior designer. He must have claimed he was hiring her for a project." Michael typed furiously. "A tale as old as time," he murmured. "Inflated invoices, phantom consultation fees. It's a classic way to move marital assets to a third party before a divorce. It's traceable, but messy." While Michael chased the money, Clara knew she had to chase the other ghost, Beatrice Thorne. She had to know if her wild guess was just that, a guess, or something real. With a trembling hand, she found the number for the retirement community in Boca Raton and dialed, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm of hope and fear. "Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 6, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance của câu chuyện." The first 3 times Clara called, Beatrice Thorne hung up the moment she heard her voice. The first time, it was an abrupt click after Clara's hopeful "Beatrice." The second, a sharp, inhaled gasp, followed by the dead tone of the line. The third time, Clara managed to say, "Please, don't hang up," before she was met with silence again. Each rejection was a small, sharp blow, reinforcing the wall of fear and secrecy that had surrounded the Thorne family for decades. On the 4th try, Clara didn't give her the chance. The instant the line connected, She spoke in a torrent of words, a desperate, breathless plea before the inevitable click. "Beatrice, please don't hang up. It's Clara. Marcus is trying to take my baby. He's telling the court that his son isn't his. He's trying to leave me with nothing. You told me the foundation of the house was built on a lie. Please, I need to know what you meant. I'm not just fighting for me anymore. I'm fighting for my child's future." She stopped, her chest heaving, her knuckles white where she gripped the phone. On the other end of the line, there was no click. There was only a long, humming silence, filled with the faint, crackling static of a long-distance call. Clara could hear the shaky, shallow breaths of the older woman, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the sound of a lifetime of fear. Finally, a voice, frail as old parchment, whispered into the receiver, "He was always such a cold boy." The words were so unexpected, so filled with a detached, ancient sorrow that Clara didn't know how to respond. "Even as a child," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the act of confession. "He didn't get that from me. He got that from Alastair. Or, the man I let him believe was his father." Clara's heart stopped. She sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The wild, improbable theory that had been a desperate legal strategy was now crystallizing into a devastating human truth. "What are you saying, Beatrice?" she breathed. Another long pause, heavier this time, as if Beatrice were gathering the last of her courage to unburden a soul that had carried this secret for over 40 years. "Alastair was sterile," she said, the words coming out in a pained rush. "An illness as a young man. He could never have children, but he needed an heir. His ego, his pride, the son in Thorn and Son had to exist. It was his obsession." The story spilled out, a torrent of memory and regret. "He was a cruel man, Clara, a powerful man who got whatever he wanted. He arranged it." "Arranged what?" Clara whispered, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. "He found a donor." Beatrice's voice cracked. "A young man at the university, smart, healthy. It was all very clinical, anonymous. Alastair made me. He forced me to go through with it. It was a business transaction to him. The price of my comfortable life was to produce his heir. I was young, and I was terrified of him. I did what he said." Clara could picture it. A young, frightened Beatrice, trapped in a gilded cage, her body used as a vessel for one man's ambition. "Marcus was born, and Alastair claimed him," Beatrice continued, her voice trembling. "The young man was paid, and he disappeared. No one ever knew. Marcus doesn't know. He believes with all his soul that he is the blood heir to the Thorn Empire. He worships the memory of the father who built the company, a man who wasn't even his father." The world tilted on its axis for the second time in a month. This was the lie. The foundational, earth-shattering lie upon which Marcus had built his entire identity, his arrogance, his entitlement, his chilling certainty that the world owed him everything. He wasn't just the son of a powerful man. He was the product of a transaction, an asset acquired to fulfill a legacy. And in a stroke of cruel irony, he had become just like the man who had orchestrated his existence. Cold, controlling, and obsessed with the purity of a bloodline that wasn't even his own. "Who was the donor, Beatrice?" Clara asked, her mind racing. "Do you have a name?" "No," she whimpered. "Alastair handled everything. He burned all the records. He said the secret would die with the two of us. I never thought Marcus would become so much like him. The same cruelty, the same need to control everything." After the call, Clara sat in stunned silence for a full hour, the receiver still resting in its cradle. The DNA test wasn't a long shot anymore. It was a ticking time bomb placed directly under Marcus Thorne's throne. She had reached into the past and found the ghost that had haunted this family for generations. And soon, she was going to bring it into the light. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 7. Tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm. Sentimental romance của câu chuyện. The day before they were due back in court, Michael Finch called. There was a note of quiet, professional triumph in his voice that made Clara's heart beat a little faster. I found it, he said, without preamble. It's clever. I'll give him that. Clara, Nina, and Michael gathered in the law firm's small, sunlit conference room, a space that had become their war room. Michael laid out a series of flowcharts and bank statements on the polished table, his finger tracing the intricate, shadowy path the money had taken. He set up a blind trust in the British Virgin Islands, Michael explained, pointing to a box on his chart. He's the grantor, but the beneficiary is listed under a shell corporation. It's all perfectly legal on the surface, but the trust has a single, very specific triggering event. Let me guess, Nina said, her arms crossed. The finalization of his divorce. Exactly, Michael confirmed with a grim nod. Upon the finalization of his divorce from you, Clara, the shell corporation is dissolved, and the sole beneficiary is revealed to be Sloane Ashford. Clara stared at the documents, the clinical black and white of the bank statements painting a vivid, painful picture. She saw the dates of the transfers, large, round sums, spirited away from their joint accounts. One transfer coincided with their 8th wedding anniversary, a day Marcus had claimed he had to spend in marathon meetings. In reality, he had been liquidating their shared future and handing it to his mistress. He's funneled over $15 million into it over the last 8 months, Michael continued, his voice neutral, but his eyes held a sympathetic light. It's almost all of the liquid marital assets. The rest is tied up in company stock and real estate. He slid another document across the table. He was planning on leaving you with the house, which is mortgaged to the hilt, and a mountain of debt from jointly held credit lines he maxed out. He wasn't just leaving you, he was orchestrating a complete financial annihilation. A cold fury, pure and clean, burned away the last vestiges of Clara's grief. The man she had once loved, the man whose child she was carrying, had not only betrayed her emotionally, but had also meticulously plotted her ruin. He wanted to leave her destitute, a single mother with no resources, forced to crawl back to him and accept whatever scraps he offered. "We have him, don't we?" she asked, her voice steady. "On the money?" "Yes," Michael confirmed. "We can prove fraudulent conveyance. The paper trail is undeniable. We can claw back every single cent for the marital estate." He packed his papers back into his briefcase, then paused, looking at Clara with a new level of respect. "But what you have with this DNA business, that's something else entirely. You're not just going after his money, Mrs. Sterling, you're going after his name." And as she prepared for court the next day, Clara knew that was the entire point. He had tried to steal her child's name and legitimacy. He had tried to rewrite their history, painting her as the villain to justify his own treachery. Now, she was about to watch as the truth did the exact same thing to him. She chose her outfit with care, not a somber, victim's black, but a simple, elegant, cream-colored maternity dress. It was a statement of quiet defiance, a symbol of the new life she was protecting. As she stood before the mirror, she placed a hand on her swelling belly, feeling the strong, steady flutter of her son. The fear she had felt during the first court appearance was gone, replaced by a profound, almost serene sense of purpose. She was no longer the trembling victim who had collapsed on the floor. In the past weeks, she had been forged into something new. The fight for her son's future, combined with the earth-shattering secret she now held, had created a core of steel within her. Her movements were deliberate. Her back was straight. When Nina picked her up, the lawyer gave her an approving look. You look ready, Nina said. I am, Clara replied, her voice calm. Let's go finish this. She was walking back into the same courtroom, a place of profound humiliation and pain. But this time, she wasn't walking in as the accused. She was walking in as the architect of a reckoning. Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 8, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance, của câu chuyện. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B was even more charged than before. The recess had allowed the drama to marinate, and the room was buzzing with a low murmur of anticipation. Reporters, sensing a bigger story than a typical high society divorce, had taken up a few spots in the back of the gallery. Robert Peterson and Marcus Thorne sat at their table, projecting an aura of bored impatience, as if this whole affair were a theatrical nuisance they were being forced to endure. Marcus looked immaculate as always in a dark charcoal suit, but Clara, with eyes now sharpened by betrayal, noticed a tiny, pulsing muscle in his jaw. A tell. He was not as calm as he appeared. The subpoena for his father's medical records had clearly rattled him, an unexpected move that had breached the walls of his carefully constructed fortress. Across the gallery, Sloane Ashford was back in her seat. Today, she wore a sleek black dress, an outfit of mock solemnity. The smug smirk, however, was still firmly in place. To her, this was just the final act of a play where her victory was already scripted. She caught Clara's eye and, with breathtaking insolence, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible wink. In that moment, Clara felt not a flicker of pain or intimidation, only a profound, pitying contempt. Sloane thought she was about to become the queen of a vast empire, but she had no idea she was sitting on the edge of a sinkhole. Clara sat beside Nina, not as a client needing protection, but as a partner in a strategy about to come to fruition. She felt a strange, quiet, calm settle over her. The worst had already happened. All that was left was the truth. All rise, the bailiff called out. Judge Evelyn Roth entered and took her seat, her face as stern and impassive as ever. She surveyed the room, her gaze resting for a moment on the 2 sealed manila envelopes on her desk. They seemed to pulsate with the secrets they contained. We are reconvened in the matter of Thorne versus Thorne, the judge began, her voice resonating with authority. Before the recess, the court was prepared to read the results of a court-ordered paternity test. Subsequently, the court also ordered a Y chromosome analysis to be performed. The accredited lab has delivered both sets of results, and they have been in the sole possession of this court. I will now unseal them and read them into the official record. A hush fell over the room. It was so quiet, Clara could hear the soft whirring of the clock on the wall, each tick a countdown to detonation. Judge Roth picked up the first envelope, the one concerning the paternity of Clara's baby. She slid a letter opener beneath the flap and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. The silence stretched, becoming taut and unbearable. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his mask of indifference slipping into one of keen interest. Sloane held her breath. Regarding the paternity of the male fetus, carried by Mrs. Clara Sterling, the judge read, her voice clear and unwavering. The analysis compared the fetal DNA profile to the DNA profile of Mr. Marcus Thorne. The results are as follows. She looked up from the paper, her gaze landing directly on Marcus. The probability of paternity is 99.99%. She paused, letting the words sink in. Mr. Thorne, according to the state's highest scientific standards, you are the father of this child. A collective exhale swept through the room. Nina reached over and gave Clara's hand a firm, triumphant squeeze. Clara felt a wave of validation so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes, but she willed them back. This was only the first battle, the first truth. Marcus's face was a stony mask, but a flush of angry red crept up his neck. Robert Peterson whispered furiously in his ear, likely reassuring him that this changed nothing, that child support was merely a financial nuisance they could manage. Across the room, Sloane's confident smirk faltered for the first time. It was replaced by a flicker of pure, undiluted annoyance. This complicated the clean break she had envisioned. A child was a permanent link, a recurring financial and emotional drain that would tether Marcus, however slightly, to the woman she had worked so hard to displace. Still, she recomposed herself quickly. The money was the real prize, and she was sure they still had all of it. "Well," Peterson said, standing with a practiced air of magnanimity, "it seems my client was mistaken, driven to suspicion by the emotional turmoil of a failing marriage. He will, of course, meet his obligations to the child. Now, if that concludes this matter, we can move on to the equitable distribution of assets." He was trying to seize control, to minimize the loss and steer the conversation back to his territory. But Judge Roth held up a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "We are not concluded, Mr. Peterson," she said, her tone sharp, commanding. "Sit down." Peterson sat abruptly, looking stunned. The judge then picked up the second envelope. This one was thicker, containing a more complex report. The air in the room, which had momentarily relaxed, grew tense once more. Marcus's eyes were locked on that envelope, a new kind of fear dawning in their depths. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was a weapon that had been aimed at him, and the judge was about to pull the trigger. "Chắc chắn rồi. Dưới đây là chương 9, tiếp nối phiên bản lãng mạn và tình cảm, sentimental romance, của câu chuyện." This court also has the results of a Y chromosome short tandem repeat analysis, Judge Roth announced, her voice dropping slightly, taking on a gravitas that commanded every ounce of attention in the room. This test was performed to compare the genetic lineage of Mr. Marcus Thorne with biological tissue belonging to his late father, Mr. Alastair Thorne, obtained from the archives of St. Jude's Medical Center. Peterson shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant to the divorce proceedings. This is a private family matter. Your objection is noted and overruled, Mr. Peterson," the judge said, her eyes flashing with impatience. "Your client made lineage the cornerstone of his argument. He opened this door. The court is now simply walking through it. Please sit down, or I will have you removed for contempt." Peterson, pale and shaken, sank back into his chair. Marcus was no longer trying to hide his agitation. He was staring at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. What could it possibly say? What did it matter? He was a thorn. He had always been a thorn. It was the only truth he had ever known. Judge Roth tore open the seal. She unfolded the multi-page report, her eyes scanning the technical language and charts. The silence in the courtroom was now so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical pressure. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the foundation. After what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up. She did not look at Clara or the lawyers. She looked directly, and with an expression of cold pity, at Marcus Thorne. The Y chromosome is passed directly from father to son, with very little mutation, creating a clear and undeniable genetic fingerprint of a paternal line, she explained, her voice now clinical, as if she were a professor delivering a lecture. The analysis compared 23 markers on the Y chromosome from the sample of Alastair Thorne and the sample of Marcus Thorne. She paused, letting the weight of her next words gather. Of the 23 markers compared, there are 0 matches. End of. For a heartbeat, the words didn't seem to register. 0 matches. The phrase hung in the dead air of the courtroom, an abstract scientific statement devoid of context. Then the meaning crashed down with the force of a tidal wave. A loud, disbelieving gasp came from the gallery. It was Sloane. Her face, moments before a mask of bored superiority, was now a canvas of utter shock. Her perfectly painted lips were parted in a silent "oh," her eyes wide with horrified comprehension. Marcus Thorne simply stared. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pallid sheen. He looked at the judge, then at his lawyer, then at Clara, his expression one of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. It was the look of a man who had been told the sky was green, that gravity no longer existed. The fundamental law of his universe had just been repealed. "That's impossible," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. He half rose from his chair, pointing a trembling finger at the bench. "That test is wrong. It's fraudulent. She did this." His finger swiveled to point at Clara. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne." Judge Roth's voice was like the crack of a whip. "This test was ordered, performed by a state-certified lab with an unbroken chain of custody. The results are scientifically irrefutable. You are not the biological son of Alastair Thorne." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic buzz of whispers. Reporters were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Robert Peterson looked like he'd been punched in the gut, his slick confidence completely stripped away. He was shuffling through his papers, looking for a script, a procedure for a situation this bizarre, and finding nothing. What does this mean?" Marcus asked, his voice now small, childlike. Nina Chen stood, her demeanor poised and lethal. "I can explain what it means, Your Honor." All eyes turned to her. "It means, Your Honor, that Mr. Thorne has potentially committed fraud on a massive scale." Nina began, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. "Upon the death of Alastair Thorne, my client's husband inherited the entirety of Thorne and Son properties, as well as control of the Thorne Family Heritage Trust, a fund valued at over $200 million. I have a copy of the trust's charter right here." She produced a document and placed it on the prosecutor's lectern. Article 3, Section 2 is very specific. The trust and all its assets, including the controlling shares of the company, are to be passed down through direct, verifiable biological male lineage. It was a document written by a man obsessed with his own bloodline. She turned to face Marcus, her eyes locking onto his. "It means, Mr. Thorne, that for the last 4 years you have been controlling a company and a fortune to which you have absolutely no legal claim. It means every salary you've drawn, every bonus you've been paid, every asset you've acquired using that wealth has been done under false pretenses. The very foundation of your life is a lie." The word hung in the air. Lie. The same word Beatrice had whispered to Clara at the funeral. Sloane Ashford stood up abruptly. The intricate web of her future, the mansions, the yachts, the endless river of money, was not just fraying, it was being incinerated before her eyes. The man she had attached herself to was not the powerful scion of an old money dynasty. He was a fraud, an imposter. Her face, once a picture of smug beauty, twisted into an ugly snarl of rage and betrayal. She looked at Marcus not with sympathy, but with pure, venomous hatred. "You lied to me," she hissed, her voice loud enough to carry through the stunned courtroom. "You told me you owned everything. You told me she would be left with nothing." Marcus, still reeling, turned to her, his expression pleading. "Sloane, I didn't know." "Don't you Sloane me," she spat, her voice dripping with disgust. She grabbed her designer handbag from the bench. "You are nothing. You have nothing." Without a backward glance, she turned and stormed towards the exit, her heels clicking an angry staccato on the marble floor. She shoved her way past a reporter, trying to ask her a question, and burst through the courtroom doors, slamming them shut behind her. The performance was over. The star actress had walked out the moment she realized her leading man wasn't going to be paid. The spectacle of Sloane's exit seemed to finally break Marcus's catatonic state. The bewilderment in his eyes was replaced by a terrifying, all-consuming rage. This was his ultimate nightmare: public humiliation, the loss of control, the utter demolition of his identity. Everything was being taken from him. His head snapped toward Clara, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated malice. He saw her not as the mother of his child or the woman he once promised to love, but as the architect of his ruin. "You," he seethed, the word a venomous dart. "You did this. You conniving, you dug all this up to destroy me." I blinked. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched as if to grab her, to physically attack her. Instantly, two burly bailiffs who had been watching the scene unfold moved in, intercepting him. They each grabbed an arm, their grips like iron vices. "That's enough, Mr. Thorne," one of them said, his voice a low growl. Marcus struggled against them, his expensive suit wrinkling, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am?" The question, once a threat, was now just pathetic. The entire room knew the answer: nobody. "Mr. Thorne, if you do not compose yourself, I will have you held in contempt, and you will spend the night in a jail cell to think about your actions," Judge Roth warned, her voice glacial. "Your outburst here, in front of your pregnant, estranged wife, has been noted by the court." The fight seemed to drain out of Marcus all at once. He went limp in the bailiff's grasp, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. They escorted him back to his chair, where he collapsed, burying his face in his hands. The great Marcus Thorne, CEO and titan of industry, was weeping like a broken child. Judge Roth surveyed the wreckage of the man's life with a stern, unwavering gaze. She looked at the abandoned lawyer's table, the empty chair in the gallery where the mistress had been, and the shell of a man who had just lost everything. Then her eyes settled on Clara. For the first time, Clara saw something other than judicial impartiality in the judge's expression. It was a look of profound, woman-to-woman understanding, and perhaps a quiet, steely respect. "Well, Miss Chen," Judge Roth said, her voice returning to its formal cadence, though the undertone was unmistakable. "It appears the entire financial landscape of this case has fundamentally changed. The matter of marital assets seems to be far more complex than we initially thought." Nina Chen gave a small, grim smile. "Indeed, Your Honor, indeed." The unraveling of Marcus Thorne was swift and total. The Thorne Family Heritage Trust, now managed by a distant cousin, unearthed by a frantic board of directors, sued him for 4 years of fraudulent gains. The board of Thorne and Son fired him, citing catastrophic reputational damage. The media turned him into a citywide cautionary tale of greed and deception. Stripped of his name, his fortune, and his power, the man who once commanded boardrooms became a social pariah, buried under a mountain of legal debt. The divorce settlement was a stunning reversal of fortune. The $15 million Marcus had tried to hide with Sloane was traced, recovered, and awarded entirely to Clara. She also kept the marital home free and clear of its mortgage, which was settled as part of the damages. Marcus was left with nothing but court-ordered child support payments for the son he had tried to disown, a permanent, monthly reminder of his ultimate failure. A few months later, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Leo. He was a new beginning, a clean slate. She sold the cold glass house filled with ghosts and, with a portion of her settlement, bought a windswept piece of land overlooking the ocean, the same stretch of coastline where Marcus had once proposed. It was an act not of sentimentality, but of reclamation. There, she did what she was always meant to do. She built. She founded her own small, successful architectural firm. In a move of quiet, personal victory, she named it Sterling and Son. It was a reclamation of the name, now imbued with honesty and her own hard-won strength. Her first project was her own home. It was not a monument of glass and steel designed to impress, but a warm, welcoming structure of wood and stone, with wide windows that drank in the sunlight and a sturdy foundation that could withstand any storm. One golden afternoon, looking out at the steady, rhythmic waves from the home she had created, holding the son she had fought for, Clara felt a profound peace. She had been tested in the most brutal of ways, her life demolished by a man living a lie. But from the ruins, she had emerged not as a victim, but as the architect. She had built a new life, a new home, and a new future, all on the only foundation that truly mattered, the truth.